There's something really unsettling about where I feel this is going. The kiddie music, the inventiveness of the kid hopping into a suitcase, all to be like, look, we enslaved this native tribe. Whoa. Trigger warning up front, folks. Depending on who you ask, what you're about to witness might be the most intense concentration of Italiophobia. Not that I'm going to be undermining the plight of Italian Americans at the turn of the century, or that I'm going to be sitting here making a bunch of spicy meatball Mario jokes. But we will be attempting to take the wind out of Columbus's vaunted sails, which some conservatives make sound like it's the biggest hate crime Italians have experienced since the 1800s. But I digress. Digress. Today, we're going to be looking at this video from PragerU. We're going to hear him out, and ultimately, I'll try to make a case for why maybe we shouldn't be so wholeheartedly celebrating Columbus. And I want to be clear up front, it's not a straw man to argue against the idea of celebrating him. You know, we're not talking about some moderate position of like, oh, well, he was a flawed person, but, you know, we're just going to kind of recognize his historical context. No, these people want us to celebrate Columbus, which is the position that we'll be taking down today. And you can tell they're desperate to celebrate the man because they literally made a stupid kid's book about it. We might get around to this today. I'll see how long it takes me to record this first bit, but let's get into it.
For centuries, he was universally admired as a hero. Now, he's widely considered to be a despoiler of paradise, an enslaver, and a genocidal maniac. So which is true? Is he a hero or a villain? The truth is complicated, as the truth often is.
The truth is complicated, but we're definitely taking the side of celebrating him.
Columbus was born in 1451 in the port city of Genoa, Italy. His father was a middle-class wool weaver who expected his son to follow the same path. But Columbus had different plans.
I love how much time and energy is put into building up Columbus as this adventurer when that's literally irrelevant to the conversation of whether he was a moral good or not. Like, his rags to riches story doesn't change the details of his slave colony, you know? But this weird narrative building is super important to an ideology that wants to inspire its constituents with rags to riches stories. Like, the very foundation of conservative economic arguments is this kind of rags to riches dream. It requires veneration of these kind of stories, even though when we're talking about literally the question they're trying to frame here, is he a villain or a hero, it really doesn't matter that his dad was a wool weaver.
Except for a compass and the stars, Columbus had virtually no navigation tools at his disposal. He was, to mix metaphors, flying blind.
Literally, what does this matter? I feel like I'm just beating a dead horse here, but like, this is so irrelevant to a moral discussion.
On the night of October 11th, Columbus spotted land. He called it San Salvador. Today, we know it as the Bahamas. There, Columbus and his men encountered the Taino tribe. The first encounter between Europe and the Americas went well. The Taino were curious and helpful. Columbus was emphatic that his crew treat them with kindness and respect.
Important to note here, upon meeting the Taino tribe, he immediately went to his journal and wrote that they could be subjugated easily, that their goodwill and curious nature could be utilized to turn them into efficient slaves. Something he's not going to bring up, of course.
Lest you think that Columbus stumbled on the Garden of Eden, the islands were also inhabited by the Caribs, a tribe of cannibals for whom, according to Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Samuel Eliot Morison, babies were a delicacy.
Ask yourself this very important question. Does the relative barbarity of some of the nations they ran into justify what we might discover happens later? I, a simpleton over here, would argue that it is fucking irrelevant to conversations about, the slave system that he ran. But to PragerU, it services as a very helpful tool to try to distance the conversation from a discussion of how awful was his slave system, to instead focus on, oh, they weren't angels. As if that justifies the subjugation that he then put a bunch of nations through. Like, he did not just focus on the cannibals, and even if he did, again, that wouldn't justify it.
Upon his return to Spain, word of the Italian explorer's successful voyage quickly spread throughout Europe.
He conveniently forgets to mention that he was criminally charged by the Spanish crown. His system of slavery was so barbaric, the King and Queen of Spain literally got angry at him, and I can't remember if they jailed him or just fined him, but he was reprimanded, is what I'm trying to say. Because he may or may not make this argument later on. Again, this whole conversation is weirdly distanced from an actual topic of morality. But a common response you hear from conservatives is that every society had a slave state, which is more or less true, but not every slave society was built the same. Some slave societies almost resembled what we would understand as indentured servitude, where you sign on for a couple decades or something, or you're forced into it for a couple decades, but eventually you gain full citizenship after your term has expired. In other slave societies, the slaves had rights. I can't remember if it was Greek or Rome, but one of the two, a slave owner could be criminally charged if they hurt or hit or injured one of their slaves. Whereas, upon hearing the utter inhumanity of Columbus's slave operation in the Bahamas, the king and queen were upset. Hey folks, Editing Piley here. I realized that in my initial recording, I didn't take time to go over some of the atrocities of Columbus's colony, so let's do that. Trigger warning, of course, this stuff gets kind of brutal, so skip to this timecode if you'd like to avoid it. As far as his treatment of the natives is concerned, his colony would either torture, kill, or sometimes rape the natives in order to try to get information about where gold was supposedly located. And when forcing the natives to search for said gold, they put really strict quotas on how much gold people needed to find in a set number of months, and then when they didn't find that much gold because there wasn't much, they would cut their hands off. And if, for some chauvinistic reason, you can write off that atrocity in your mind, might I interest you in the way that he treated fellow Europeans? There were multiple graphic forms of punishment in public, which apparently involved disembowelment. He at times had people executed for very minor crimes, and in one very specific case that was discovered within the last 15 years or so, she had a woman's tongue cut out for mentioning that he was the son of a wool weaver. So yeah, altogether pretty brutal colony. Anyways, back to the video.
Columbus was not blameless. He sold natives into slavery. But the explorer did not invent slavery.
Literally no one is claiming that, dumbass. Also, I love how he just skips over, yes, he sold them into slavery, as if he's just like, oh, okay, here's these people, go over that way. Not as if he, operated a colony, but let's hear him out more fully.
But the explorer did not invent slavery, which was common around the world long before and long after Columbus's time.
Okay, what did I tell you? He completely skipped over the conversation about the relative, and again, we're talking about relative. I guess morality's not the word. It's whether your slave state was shit or whether your slave state was shit. Because it is necessary for conservatives to distance the conversation about Columbus from his system's relative immorality in order to not poison this otherwise really helpful rags to riches narrative.
It's unfair to focus only on Columbus's sins. It's also unfair to judge someone who lived 500 years ago by today's standards.
According to Michael Knowles, it is unfair to judge him by his sins, but it is totally fair to ignore those sins in a video trying to celebrate the man. Also, again, this is where the point about the crown charging him comes into play. He is not bad by today's standards. There is a good case to be made. He was rather immoral by his own time's standards.
His own assessment of his actions is much more revealing. Let those who are fond of blaming and finding fault while they sit safely at home, ask, "Why did you not do thus and so?"
Yeah, I'm gonna take his word on whether or not he was a bad guy. You don't get to claim moral supremacy just because you went out and you're like, oh, I just had to make some hard decisions about how brutal I had to be to these natives. Like, you don't get the trump card on that one, bro. So yeah, color me shocked. In a video that claims to be about answering the question of whether or not he's a hero or a villain, they sure do spend very little time trying to make that argument. They instead spend most of their time appealing to a rags to riches type storyline, as if we should celebrate Columbus because he reminds us of Rocky, dude. Anyways, let's switch on over to Michael Knowles again here, reading through this like PragerU line of kids books. Let's see how they try to make the story palatable to the youths.
Today is Columbus Day. What an exciting day it's been. We pretended to be explorers and travel the world. Dennis pulled out a suitcase. "This can be our time machine," he said. "Hop in."
There's something really unsettling about where I feel this is going. The kiddie music, the inventiveness of the kid hopping into a suitcase, all to be like, look, we enslaved this native tribe. Whoa.
We landed in Spain in 1492. Christopher Columbus was about to sail the ocean blue. "I'm a Christopher," he said. "Nice to meet you."
That might be a level of Italiophobia that rivals Chris Pratt as Mario. Jesus.
"I'm going to sail to India by heading to the west." Dennis asked, "How can you be sure that route really is the best?" "I have a compass and quadrant, which I will use every day."
It's funny that in the previous video, they said he sailed across the sea with nothing but a compass. I'm going to see if I can pull up the little graphic. Yeah, they said nothing but a compass and the stars. Now all of a sudden, he's got one of those angular little thingies. It's almost like pointing out that all he had was a compass was a stupid narrative building argument to try to argue that he was some sort of maverick and that justifies slavery.
"That's a nice gift from the King and Queen of Spain," Columbus said. "It's not just a gift. They have..."
Okay, they did. Why the fuck is the pointy part of La Pinta in front of the sail, but behind up here? Do they really not care to like check the details here? Come on, guys, you got fracking money. You can figure this out.
Columbus established a settlement and brought back many treasures,
which included slaves. Convenient that he ignores that.
This would eventually lead to a wondrous new creation, the United States of America, a mighty, great nation.
Oh, see, it's really interesting and kind of insidious, because in the first video, he doesn't really link it to America so much. But of course, in the video for kids, you gotta make that as patriotic as possible, brother.
We jumped in our suitcase, even though I was hesitant, and zoom, went to 1937 to meet the US president. "Hurry, Otto!" shouted Dennis. "There's no time to delay. President Franklin Roosevelt has something important to say." We didn't want to miss it. This was going to be good. "From this day forward," we heard the president say, "this day in October shall be called Columbus Day."
I love how in literally any other conversation, they would be like, this evil socialist, this evil tyrant FDR, worst president ever type beat. But because he made this holiday, he's all of a sudden like there's this reverent music behind him because he's recognizing such a great explorer. It's a great encapsulation of how, to a lot of conservatives, whether or not you're good or bad is entirely dependent on how useful you are to argue their point.
We honor Columbus for his courage, for being the first person to connect the New World to the Old World of Europe, and for making America possible.
I mean, the historical reason we celebrate Columbus Day was to try to curb some anti-Italian racism that was going on. But slowly over time, the holiday became a convenient manifest destiny-esque, like self-justifying narrative. So here we are. Now that's what Columbus Day means. So yeah, that was about all I had expected. I guess it bums me out. I just know in the back of my mind there's a bunch of absolute chud parents out there who would buy this shit. So seeing as there was surprisingly little moral arguments made. I guess I'll try to wrap up here a little bit. Columbus is not unfairly maligned by today's standards. He was kind of shitty even by his own standards. What his arrival means for Western civilization to spread into the Americas is not so holistically good as he would lead you to believe here. Like, he doesn't make this argument, but a typical conservative argument is that this place was just like savage and war-torn and all that stuff, as if the 100 Years' War wasn't, I think, literally still going on, or at the very least, recently ended in Europe. Hey folks, Editing Piley again. Lest we think Europeans are just so enlightened and left all that barbarity behind them at the homeland, let's take a look at some of the more barbarous moments from our early encounters with native peoples. Once again, trigger warning, this stuff also gets pretty violent. Skip to this time code if you'd like. Responses to native violence were often pretty disproportionate, like using the Pequot War as an example. A raid in early 1637 that killed 9 Europeans was met with a village-leveling fire and massacre, which seems to have killed an estimated at least couple hundred. And although early colonists did encounter some cannibal tribes, they weren't alone in that particular brand of barbarity. Like, there are reports of European colonies putting the heads of their enemies on spikes out in the town square and all that, as well as the public punishment of being fayed alive, which I'm gonna mince words here to avoid YouTube demonetization, when the outer layer of your head part gets peeled back and then they take out your guts. Quite the sophisticated culture, if I do say so myself. That is, of course, a much too quick overview. There's plenty of literature on the subject if you'd like to read more, but suffice it to say, ignoring the barbarity Europeans brought along with them is intellectually dishonest and just kind of makes me mad, so I wanted to clear the record on that one. Anyways, back to the video. When we talk about colonizing the Americas, I think a lot of us make the mistake of thinking of some more like North American nations and tribes, which isn't to say the nations and tribes of the North were unadvanced. For example, the Iroquois had something resembling a federal state governing system for, depending on who you ask, a couple centuries or at least a couple decades before, the United States penned a similar one into a constitution. But when we focus on or think about the livelihoods of like the Sioux tribes or some of those more roaming nations, we forget just how developed South America was at the time. They had dense city structures, they had irrigation, and I believe some of them had indoor plumbing. Editing Piley, feel free to correct me if that's wrong. A lot of the nations were also super on top of astronomy. I think we even unconsciously buy too much into the propaganda point that the Americas were savage, and we just completely forget a variety of ways in which the Americas were relatively developed, even by today's standards. A lot of native nations recognized the diversity of gender identity in a way that conservatives 500 and so years later even struggle to wrap their heads around. And it's important to pick apart this kind of narrative building because it is a narrative that exists to justify colonization. Like, again, ask yourself why they brought up that some of the people that Columbus ran into were cannibals. It's an attempt to say, well, really, we were doing them a service by coming over and spreading our Western civilization, when the reality is Western civilization was, in some ways, behind the times for these tribes. Hey folks, it's Editing Piley again for the final time. Just want to make clear, the Eurocentric definition of advanced civilizations, one that views a developing culture like a fucking skill tree, is itself a flawed framework. Cultures develop in different ways, on their own timelines, so whether or not they've discovered indoor plumbing by year X doesn't mean they should get stamped with the barbaric or underdeveloped labels. So when I point out the advances of native nations, I'm not aiming to support this framework, merely using the classic schoolyard, their rubber and your glue to try to point out that even by Western civilization's own dumb advancement standards, native nations weren't as barbaric or behind the times as some would lead you to believe. Anyways, back to the video. So no, Columbus was not that great of a guy, and I don't think, even if you enjoy things about the foundation of America, even if you're like, the Constitution is ahead of its time and it's a great foundational document for, democracy and all that, you still don't have to celebrate, which is again what they're trying to do here, celebrate Columbus. But the problem is that when you start to question some things about Columbus, as far as it relates to the American project, then you start to question some other things about the foundation of America. And I'm sure Michael Knowles, whether consciously or not, wants to keep us away from some of those answers. But anyways, that'll be it for the video today. I'd say happy Columbus Day, but fuck the guy. Now, let's turn it on over to the pre-recorded outro pilot. Be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, like early versions of every video, and exclusive Patreon-only videos. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, you get your name read off at the end of every video, which I am about to do once I pull up the names. Zoth, Revo Pregame, Emily, Kyle Foley, Jennifer Jones, Caffeine Unicorn, Goblin of the Year, Stockwell Homestead, Nillick Elites, Floof Pants, and Cameron Fordo. So if you want to hear your lovely name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.